Rory and myself and Sue to answer the questions at the end of the talk. We're thinking about this evening then about principles of creating flower-rich meadows, and it's a huge topic, and we're going to just aim to do that, to try and highlight some of the really key principles that we've gained from experience of making meadows with our members over the last few years in Herefordshire. I'm drawing on the vast experience of meadow making in all sorts of counties around the country in recent years. So I just wanted to introduce Herefordshire Meadows very briefly for those of you who don't know anything about us. We are a facilitation fund group with Natural England funding, and we set up in 2016. We started with 30 core group members, farmers, smallholders and estate managers across the county. And we've grown that group to now 63 members. And there are 450 other meadow owners and enthusiasts on our wider network who are able to come along to our talks, such as many of you this evening, and our other training days that we have. And the aim of the group is it's a discussion group. It's all about sharing best practice and learning from each other, rather than one-to-one advice, which is how this kind of work was traditionally delivered in the past. So we have discussion groups. Here you can see us up on the edge of the Black Mountains. We've got a whole range of topics we're talking about: grazing strategies, managing flower-rich woodland rides and glades. We've included things like herbal lays, all kinds of diverse swords, meat boxes, all different aspects of meadow restoration and creation, and wildflower seedling safaris. You'll see the importance of that when we come to talking about the first winter of management after you've created a meadow being such an important time. And the aim is that we all share what works and help people to do things, not to have to reinvent the wheel, and everybody shares what they'd like to do, doing things differently, learning from the experience that they've gained. So training people to be able to identify plants and bumblebees and other insects as well is an important part of what we've been doing in the summer months. And we hope to be out and about again this summer doing that training work, training days. And we've devised some rapid monitoring methods that could be done by pretty well anybody. So it might be the farmer, the smallholder, landowner. They might be working with a local volunteer or a helper, somebody enthusiastic from their village, in order to be able to monitor, do a kind of baseline survey before restoration takes place, and then monitor the changes over time so that we can all see the results of the work that we've put into place and the methods that we've used for restoration, and really see whether we're getting more plant diversity, more plant abundance, increasing numbers of pollinators, visiting the plants in our meadows and that kind of thing. So that's a very important part of what we're doing. So here you can see, as well as the meetings and discussions that we do, we have a whole, we've been lucky to get some additional funding to boost the work that the group could do. So some people are in countryside stewardship schemes, and they've got funding to be able to restore meadows in that. But increasingly that's hard to come by. And we're in an interim now really between the higher level stewardship schemes that used to support that in quite some large areas in the county, and waiting for the new elms schemes, which we hope will do the same. But in the interim, and in recent years, we've been lucky enough to have funding. And here's what we did in 2019, all these green sites around the county you can see, to actually do meadow restoration on the ground. We added 5 more sites on another 9 hectares of land last summer. I think the first summer was just about 50 hectares. So 9 more last summer, and we've got funding under the Green Recovery Challenge Fund for a further 56 hectares of meadow restoration this summer. So that's really what we're doing. And I think I wanted then to come on to just really thinking about being clear about where you're starting from when you're thinking about meadow restoration. Many people get in touch with us through our website. There's a contact form there if you want to get in touch with us, and they say, oh, I want to make a meadow, I want to have more diversity in my grassland, please tell me what what to do, or come and help us, give us advice on what to do. And we try and really turn that upside on its head, if you like, that question, and ask and unpick a few questions at the beginning, which really are: what's your aim? You know, what do you want? Do you really want a hay meadow? Well, firstly, we're just to be absolutely sure that you want a perennial grassland hay meadow type habitat, and that people understand the difference between that and having cornfield annuals. So it's a different thing. If you want poppies and corn cockle and cornflower and corn marigold and so on, then you're going to be, those are largely annual plants which need cultivated ground and to be planted, planted each year. They're very bright and colourful. They're doing a fantastic job in our landscape. That's very different from the kind of perennial plants that grow in a hay and annuals that grow in a hay meadow. So we sort that out to start with, and then ask people what kind of what they want, what they're aiming for. Can they manage it as a hay meadow, or do they want flower-rich pasture? And then also the other thing to think about: what kind of machinery is available to help manage for the restoration itself, and for the ongoing management. Are there livestock available? What kind of stock? And how are you planning to manage the meadow in the future? So it's really important to know what the starting point is. And this slide shows, we've chosen these slides. They're quite short grassland, but this is at a time when it's as you can see, that the grass isn't very long. So are you starting mostly from a perennial ryegrass and white clover sward, which we would call, is considered to be an agriculturally improved sward? You can see bright green, lush, folded leaves, and the herb cover is predominantly white clover. Maybe have you got one or two other species? Often it's sorrel or yarrow or ribwort plantain or something existing in this kind of sward. So this is a sward that could be quite a challenge to convert to a wildflower meadow in one single step. And it might be, you might think about going perhaps through a herbal ley or something first. But it's going to need a lot more disruption in order to make the space in there and create the opportunity for the native broadleaf plants and herbs to do well in that. So it'll need a lot of management and a longer period perhaps to be successful. So we'd advise people to think about somewhat that wouldn't be a natural choice for a wildflower meadow. So you may have, the next kind of sward that you might have is what we would consider a species poor, semi-improved sward. And here you can see some of the little plants in there. I think we've got some self-heal. There's probably some white clover. The herb cover may be high, but not diverse. So you may have a lot of you can see more broadleaf plants in there. And the grass component is also more varied. It's not just dry grass. There are some fine and unfolded leaves mixed in patches in this kind of sward. And this would be a possible starting point to create a much more diverse sward and meadow from that. So it's mostly fine leaf grasses. This could be ideal for restoration. But often what was shown, people say, I'd like to make a meadow, and maybe we don't see it at perhaps the time of year where there's as many leaves seen like this, but some of you may already have this kind of sward and thinking that this is a candidate. So here we've got, this would be an unimproved sward and moderately species rich already. So you can see a range of shapes and textures. You won't be seeing the flowers if it's grazed fairly constantly, but this kind of sward, often you may not need actually to go through any restoration by introducing additional seed. It may be that by changing the management, so either stopping mowing, and this could even be on your lawn. I think Plant Life have a no-mow May, don't they? They suggest where you might not mow your grassland if it's heavily mown and see what comes up. And the same goes for perhaps having a part of a field, excluding grazing for a while and seeing what happens. And the results can be incredibly pleasing, surprising and pleasing as well. So you can change the management slightly and see what comes up. And it will almost certainly, if you've got some of these broadleaf plants, will get more diverse with a sympathetic management. And I should say at this point that we would encourage you, if you've got this kind of sward, this is a sward that we would suggest you avoid planting up as woodland, because this is fantastically diverse, quite a rare habitat. It's got the potential to become very good a wildflower meadow or pasture, and it's sequestering a lot of carbon. It's doing all sorts of fabulous things for the environment. And if you've got other places on your land to plant trees that are not on such a diverse sward, we would consider that those would be much, much more suitable. So other things to think at the start, we've got a restoration checklist on our website where things that you might like to think about, and I'm going through some of them. So the other thing is to think about your soil. What condition is it in? What's the soil, how the soil biology like, and sampling it to think about how many nutrients are in that soil. So here we are on a day where we were looking at soil health. Typically we take a soil sample before we decide the restoration plan, so that we can understand if there's a particularly high phosphate index. This can be difficult to establish a wildflower sward, not necessarily, but it can be difficult. And we'd like to get an idea about existing organic matter levels in the soil. And increasingly, we're starting to look at soil carbon as well. So you can tell a lot about your soil just getting a spade out and having a good dig. We've got a reference on our website to under the diverse swards and soil health. You could have a look there and see some guidance of what you're looking for. And the other thing to think about is weed control. If you've got a lot of perennial weeds like creeping thistle, hogweed, dock, a list of them, then we would suggest that you prioritize weed control, and then for at least a year until the weeds are mostly under control before you spend time and effort and money on introducing new wildflower seeds from some source. So assuming that your site is suitable, then you don't already have a lot of wildflowers, and you want to add some more, you've decided to speed the process up and enhance the sward by adding some wildflowers, then we're going to just run through some of the steps that you might like to take here. So one of the things to do then is at the right time of year, so at haymaking time, or throughout the summer, you'll either graze. You need a low sward in order to be able to set about the next phases of restoration. So you might just graze in order to have a very short sward, or you might make a crop of hay if that's what you've been doing, or to start doing that for the first time, cut and collect, as is going on here. Either make a crop of hay and take it away, or cut and collect the sward so that you've got very, very low growth. And then one of the really important things here, to think about the practicalities. This is why we're asking about what machinery you have available. You can do this. I'm showing here pictures of tractor site, this is at farm scale, field scale with a tractor, but there's all sorts of pedestrian equipment that does these jobs as well in the same way, that are suitable for different scales of projects. So one of the key things is to think about these practicalities, be prepared to be adaptable. But here, the critical thing then, before you broadcast any seed or introduce seed or hay into your site, is to create enough bare ground. So what we're trying to do here is create bare ground so that the seeds that we're adding, in whatever means, have good contact with the soil. And we are also trying to disrupt the dominance of the grass. So we're talking here about having an existing sward and enhancing it and making it more flower rich. And the grass over a number of years will have set up, it's a very stable ecosystem, if you like, where the grasses are growing happily. There may be a few other broadleaf plants in those we've discussed, but there's not much space for anything else, and the grasses aren't going to let in. You can scatter seed on a really dense sward, and it's probably that would be a waste a lot of the time. So disruption is a really, really important part of this whole process. So one of the methods that our members have used very, very successfully is to think about a power harrow. Now, a lot of people are horrified at this. A lot of power harrows on farms around the county, most of them are set to harrow at quite a depth, 6 inches, 8 inches, even deeper. And you will need to ask the contractor that you're working with to reset their power harrow so that it's just going in 1/2 inch up to 1 inch maximum. And you're trying to create 50% bare ground. So here this guy has set up his power harrow, and you can see he's doing strips across this meadow, and you can see the beginnings of the disruption. That in this case, we didn't feel that had created enough of the bare ground. So it went on to come to do a second pass, which is coming on the next slide. And you can see the end of the second run. You might think, well, crikey, there's no grass left, but I can assure you there was lots of grass regrowth in the autumn afterwards. So some of the grass is getting torn out of the ground, and some of it'll die, and most of it will regrow again. But you're setting it back, and this is one of our favourite methods of the disruption that I'm talking about. It has to be said, it's not great if you've been controlling. You've controlled the docks or the other weeds on your pasture or meadow. You've done a lot of weed control, and you've controlled the weeds that are showing themselves. But if you think or you know that there's a large amount of weed seed in the seed bank, then this method is not great for that. You'll need to cause the disruption, but without going so deep. Make space in that way, and it's also not suitable on archaeological sites. So you need to think about that and get advice if you've got an archaeological site. But anything is possible if you think about the right method. So now I'm going to hand over to Sue Holland, who's going to talk about some of the some other ways of causing this disruption. So over to you, Sue.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Caroline. We've just seen the work of creating bare ground using the power harrow, and pre-restoration checks may have indicated that actually that's a bit too dramatic for some of the sites, and you've got to think of some alternative methods. So here we're looking at a site in Herefordshire on the edge of the Woolhope Dome. So it's got a limey nature and very thin soils, and on quite a steep west-facing slope. And using the power harrow here, she wasn't appropriate. So we were using spring tines here to drag and tear at the vegetation, which actually didn't dig into the soil surface so much. And it did work very well. But one of the unforeseen things about this operation, and please note this because we'll come back to that in a minute, is the huge amount of thatch that was pulled up when the spring tines were used on this site. And if we go on to the next slide, this is a little meadow in Erdersley. It's a top-notch 4-star scheduled ancient monument, and great care was needed to avoid or absolutely minimize any damage to the ground surface and the soils. So after consulting with English Heritage, once again, the only option open to creating sufficient disturbance to the ground was to use a spring tine harrow. And in that way, we were able to get about 50% bare ground. But on both these fields, we found we were having to go over 7 or 8 times in order to get sufficient open ground. And again here, if you look along the edge of the hedge, there were huge piles of thatch pulled out of the meadow. And this was completely, we hadn't come across it during our meadow restoration works in 2019. It was something we hadn't anticipated, and so some fairly novel methods had to be quickly thought of to try and remove the thatch from the sites, because it would be swamping all the bare ground, and the seedlings, the seed wouldn't have actually touched bare ground. So thanks to our the landowners, who came up with all sorts of ideas for moving it very quickly, including raking up by hand, using ride-on mowers. Here they are back at the Woolhope Meadow, using rakes to pull it down to the bottom of the slope. Ride-on mowers were bought in, and also in one case, a Rytec cut and collect machine was bought in and went over the site and lifted up all the loose grass. So just demonstrating that unforeseen things can happen, but a good solution was found in the end. So I think that's over. Back to Caroline.
Okay, thank you very much, Sue. That's a good point. That's particularly relevant where you're coming out of pasture, isn't it? And we don't tend to get that problem so much if it's been a species poor hay meadow, but certainly if you're coming out of pasture on a lot of sites, then the thatch can be an issue, especially if they haven't been grazed that much in the past. So thanks for that. So just wanted to say a little bit about floodplain meadow restoration. This is very topical with what's going on in Herefordshire with our rivers. Many people are wanting to restore floodplains for all sorts of reasons, for natural flood management and to prevent soil erosion and to give them a constantly good crop year on year on year. And you can see some demonstration plots that have been put together down at Brampton Abbots. So here, actually now the whole of this field this last year was done, has been restored, but Ben decided to try out different means of disruption. Actually, it was very helpful for us to see, being an agronomist, he put his agronomist mind to it and thought, okay, so how many passes of the harrow on this soil? So he did 1, 2, and 3 passes of power harrow in combination with different amounts of very low rates of glyphosate to cause disruption as well, and some controlled with none, and all the combinations. And it was very, very interesting to see the results there. And I hope we'll be able to have an open day, go down and visit him sometime and have a look at that. He's chosen the best method to restore the whole of the rest of the field this year. So it's possible even on floodplains. They're nutrient rich. His soil's incredibly high phosphate levels. The grasses were very vigorous. He gets more silt and lots of nutrients from other people every year, but it's still getting good results. So we're very confident that we've got some good methods for those of anyone interested in working on floodplain meadows as well. So the next slide, I don't want you to get too bogged down with the figures, but this is the work we did in 2019, a total of 49 hectares it was, just to give you, looking at the left, the different ways, the different seed sources and the restoration methods that we're using. So very often we are trying to get seed from a site that's as close as possible to the site that's being restored. So we're looking for local provenance seed that we can use with our brush harvester, and Sue's going to talk about that a little bit in the moment. The other alternative is to have green hay. So this is hay that is not fully made. It's cut as gently as possible and laid down and then moved as gently as possible while it's still green, and as quickly as possible before it heats up to the receptor site, to the new meadow that you're creating. And we'll talk a little bit about green hay method in a minute. And then the other option is to buy British wildflower seed grown in Britain from companies like Emmersgate. And there are other companies who are also growing what we call commercial wildflower seed, if you like. And you could buy a wildflower mix from them. If you're enhancing grassland and you're buying wildflower mix, it's really important. So the 100% is the important thing here. There's no point buying any more grasses unless you don't have any native grasses in there. I suppose we could discuss that. But generally, if you're enhancing grass, you are just buying wildflowers. If you're starting with bare ground, then you would typically buy a mix from a flower company. Emmersgate sell these mixes, but so do the agricultural seed suppliers, and you're buying generally 80% grasses and 20% wildflowers. So that's if you're doing arable reversion or you're coming out of a temporary lay and you want to get a more diverse lay growing. So I just wanted to show that. And some people are feeding species-rich hay out to cattle over winter. Many of the regenerative farmers and holistic grazing, rotational grazing, people using those methods are putting out bales and grazing, rolling one out a day, say, for the stock in the winter, and that's adding wildflower seed into the swards. And we're doing some vacuum harvesting as well for particular species of flowers that we want to add in some places. So now that gives you a range of the methods we're using and the seed sources. So back to you to describe the brush seed harvesting process that we're using.
Thank you. Well, as you've just seen in the previous slide, brush harvested seed has been our major seed source for the past couple of years, and fingers crossed it will be again this year. We were very fortunate in 2019 to get a grant from the Woolhope Dome Environmental Trust, and that's enabled us to buy this Logic brush seed harvester plus a trailer so that we can transport it. And you can see here Matt Cobb, our contractor, who carries out all the harvesting on his quad bike, towing the Logic harvester through one of the floodplain grasslands, actually. Using the brush harvester, we've been able to harvest seed from species-rich meadows across the county for restoring very carefully matched donor sites. And why are we quite so fussy about this, i.e. about trying to sow Herefordshire seed, harvest Herefordshire seed and sow Herefordshire seed on Herefordshire sites? This type of seeding is often referred to as natural seeding, and it ensures that we're conserving all the variation and local character of our meadows. So if you think within the county of Herefordshire, meadows in the Woolhope Dome are going to be quite different from, for example, this type of floodplain meadow. And so carefully matching donor and receptor helps maintain these differences. So the brush harvester also gives us the luxury of flexibility in terms of timing of seed broadcasting. And this isn't the case with green hay, which has to be spread on the day it's cut. And for that reason, you can't really move it vast distances. Brush harvested seed, if we go on, it's collected in the hopper at the back of the brush harvester. Then if we go on to the next slide, you can see the hopper's emptied at intervals, and the seed is then sifted on site. And then it can either be spread immediately if the receptor field has been properly prepared, or it can be taken to a barn for drying. And if we look at the next picture, this is fresh brush harvested seed, which has received that first sifting on the field and now laid out in a barn on big tarpaulins. It's turned twice a day, and it can be, and in that way it's dried, and then we can bag it up and store it until the receptor site is ready for seed broadcasting. So it does allow this, you know, timing so crucial, and it allows landowners to get their fields absolutely ready. The other thing to mention about seed harvesting is we can never escape the burden of admin. Obviously, everything we do in life seems to require huge volumes of paperwork. So direct or brush harvesting seed, which is what we're doing with the seed harvester, requires a license under the seed marketing regulations. And Herefordshire Meadows is now licensed to harvest seed. And we also have to comply with all the various Animal and Plant Health Agency regulations, which all need renewing on an annual basis. So Caroline's just going to now show a few of the other methods of collecting seed and broadcasting it.
Okay, thank you very much, Sue. I should say at this point that there are two brush seed harvesters in the county now. The Wildlife Trust have one as well, and we're pleased to say they're now registered with AFA, as Sue's described, so that they'll be able to move seed from one site to another as well. So that gives us increases the capacity to make more meadows in Herefordshire, which is absolutely fabulous. So I've got here a slide. So this is back in Woolhope. So they've stored the seed in their barn. They've waited until it's a little bit later in the summer. So I think there's some questions already about the timing. So if the harrowing is done after the hay cut. So if you make hay, but the ground's too hard for harrowing, or you're going to wait a little bit longer, so people making hay in June or July, You then either have to start the aftermath grazing, or you've been grazing perhaps until that time. So we're generally in August and through September, the harrowing is happening. And then as soon as you've harrowed and created the bare ground, that's the time to spread your seed. So this seed was all stored in a barn. It was carefully split up into different, these are all lick buckets, I think, here, split up evenly, and a team of people went across the meadow, spreading it by hand and getting it broadcast evenly across the field. So the brush harvested seed that you could see in the barn that Sue showed you, it's not just pure seed. You can't pour it through, you couldn't pour it through a funnel, for example. It's got some sort of chaff and stuff with it. So that could just be all broadcast by hand. And I have to say that people are doing this at lots of different scales. It's a tricky material. It is the best. It's the bee's knees of local. It's the best sort of wildflower seed you can get for local provenance, but it doesn't flow through agricultural machinery brilliantly. So anyway, so that's what they did there, and they did it by hand, which is great. If you're using purchased seed, you may find that that's too fine. If you're using, to make it economical, we've gone right down to 2 kilos per hectare we're spreading. Although a lot of the recommendations are you'll get faster and perhaps better results if you buy larger quantities of seed, but wildflower seed is in short supply and it's expensive. And we've had some fabulous results using 2 kilos per hectare of seed. So this is 100% wildflower seed. And often people mix that then with either sand or some very fine sawdust. Somebody used vermiculite. You can mix it with different materials to make it more easily spreadable so that you're not dealing with such tiny amounts. But I have seen one site in 2019 where the seed alone was spread very amazingly by 2 people from the farm, and they did it fantastically finely, very, very beautifully and evenly. Some people, of course, use the traditional fiddle as well, that used to be used before we had seed drills. So you could mix it with a filler. This got mixed with a filler. This seed, here we are at Morton-on-Lug, and it went in a metered spinner, basically. This might be used for anything from slug pellets, but in this time it's being used here for getting this seed, which was beautifully spread throughout 3 meadows here in the floodplain that have been. So that worked extremely well after the land was prepared. Here we can see some seed that got put in an air seeder here and a drill. This was set up so that the seed was only broadcast along the surface of the ground and not, probably this machinery has the ability to cut slits and bury the seed, which is appropriate for some crop seed. Absolutely not for wildflower seed. It needs to be on the top. You think that's what you're mimicking what's happening in a hay cut. And when you make hay, in a hay meadow and turn the hay, the seed falls out, it sits on the surface. Most of our meadow wildflower seed needs light to germinate. If you bury it, you'll lose it and not see it. It probably won't germinate. So that's with an air seeder. Here we have, this is broadcasting another piece of kit here. You can see broadcasting a mix of grasses and broadleaf plants. This is a much higher seed rate because you've got the grass and the wildflower seed. That's going in at 20 kilos per hectare, and it's going into bare ground. That came out of a temporary lay of ryegrass and white clover and went into wildflower mix. So you can see the kind of machinery that could be used as well, farm scale machinery. So here we have the green hay process. Again, we've got some good leaflets that we can and guidance that you can pick up on the resources section of our website. But here you can see somebody making green hay with their kit on the farm here. This is up at Briley, a fantastically flower-rich site. Not a huge crop of hay. It's got yellow rattle in these fields. So they made hay from the most flower-rich areas of the farm. And then they asked their neighbour to bring the teleporter across. They carried the bales quickly over to the field next door. There's a 1-to-3 ratio involved here. So they harvested, I think, about an acre of hay, and it spread it over a 3 acre, actually it was a bigger field than that, but in strips across the field next door. And this is them. So no, that's the spreader. You can see the teleporter there. Sorry, I forgot to move on. And then they came with the straw chopper and spread it that way. The hay got chopped up and spread out, and they had the most incredible results. Very good, a good range of plants. Well, a range of the plants that had seed that was ripe at that time, but the spread across the field was very even and wonderful. And they're topping that up with other wildflowers. They added some yellow rattle then over this next year. So that's at farm scale, doing green hay, spreading. People are using midi balers. This is a sort of midi-sized baler that can be pulled by a very small tractor, making bales of hay there that can be spread. And we've also got, there's pedestrian kit. I haven't actually got a photo in here, but many of you will know of the wonderful work that Peter Tierney's been doing for years around the county with pedestrian equipment. Matcom's got some now as well, and there are other people doing this work. So there's that scale equipment, and some people choose not to bale it. Actually, you're moving it from one field to the other. You're doing a small area. They cut it, ted it up very gently, and then take it on a flatbed trailer to the next field, and then spread it out again. And that can work very, very well too. So that's a little bit about green hay, using the green hay method. And then the final technique that that is possible, of course, is to use plug plants. So we find that can be very helpful for tricky species which don't, where the germination is as poor, particularly rare species where you don't see it's expensive and precious and you don't want to go scattering all over the place. You could raise a few plug plants or a lot of plug plants, and it could be helpful to kickstart a population. You could plant them in at intervals. I know this has happened in some of the floodplain meadow restorations and elsewhere, so it's just another thing to think about. It can be an expensive way of, it can be slightly more expensive, but anyway, it is definitely a possibility. So we talked about feeding hay out, didn't we? This was one of the farmers in 2019 who fed hay out to cattle over the winter, and we're seeing the results of that coming along as well. So the people have had great results. You want to see, Rob Havard in particular has had good results with some of his bale grazing over years using species-rich hay and very effectively. So what happens next then? So we've talked about methods of spreading. So the next really important thing to talk about is what happens in that first autumn and winter. So this strewing of the seed or the hay will be done at haymaking time, so probably in July, early August, and the seeding will be done when the ground is perhaps easier to prepare. Sue says you've got a broader range of conditions where you could do that work. And then, if you remember, we talked, it's really important what happens through this next winter. So here we all are on a seedling safari in 2019. You have to get up close and personal, and we've experienced this afternoon. Actually, we went to one of the sites that was seeded last year, and when you walk into the field, it looks very grassy. We had to get on our hands and knees and look through the grass, which is just really beginning to grow again now, and find little yellow rattle seedlings at this stage, and other seedlings that are growing. So the seedling safari helped us to really look at the tiny little seedlings. So you see the right-hand picture here, the growing. You really need to get your eye in. For those of you who are gardeners and you do that, you raise things in the seed tray. It's fascinating, isn't it? You see the cotyledon leaves coming to start with, then the first true leaves, and you wonder, is that really what I planted? And then you get in the end, as the plant matures, the leaf, then you come to see the leaves that perhaps you recognize throughout the rest of the year. And it's a really important skill, I think, to have to know what's going in your meadow, when things germinate, how they're doing, and it's really helpful. So we've been having these seedling safaris to help us get a good idea about management of the grassland in the first few months after seeding. And the thing that we're really thinking about over this first winter, it's not a case of just leaving these seedlings and letting them cope with the grass that's going to regrow. So particularly if you've enhanced an existing sward, as I said, you're causing this disruption, but you don't kill all the grass. You don't, and if the grass is going, and you've got good Herefordshire soil, is fertile, even if the phosphate index isn't high, and the likelihood is that the grass can swamp these tiny little seedlings, You wouldn't tolerate that in your garden. It's not a fair way to expect a little plant to grow. And so what you do over the first winter is to try and maintain the openness in the sward by whatever means you have. And it has to be said that livestock are really fantastic at this. So being able to have your graze your meadow in the first few months after you've strewn the seed is a really important thing to be able to do. You can mimic this by mowing or doing a cut, but you have to do it very, very carefully and watch the seeds. And you carry on over that first winter, keeping the sward open until such point as you see the little, if you've put yellow rattle in your mix, this plant yellow rattle, which is partly parasitizes the grasses and a few other plants, but mostly the grasses, and helps to get this to check it. It's another disruptor, if you like, in the system to create, to help alter the balance between the grasses and the broadleaf herbs. So it is an annual though. So as soon as you see the yellow rattle emerging, that's the time to turn the stock off. So this is a meadow on the left-hand side where you can still see bare patches coming into the spring. And as I said, you can either do that by gently grazing, and either you or the grazier needs to know the seedlings and be able to manage things accordingly. If you see the animals really deciding that they want to eat all the young clovers out or all the young cat's ears or something, then you move them to another field and bring them back when the grass starts to dominate again, if it does. But certainly when you see the yellow rattle emerging, if they eat that as an annual, then it's not going to survive. So that's when, at this time of year now, we're starting to see the yellow rattle. This is the stage it's at. You would take the stock out and then go on managing it from then on as a hay meadow. So there we go. That's a real canter through the meadow the meadow restoration process that we're suggesting you think about if you're interested in creating a meadow in Herefordshire. And I'm going to just finish. I think this is one of the last slides. The 4 key principles we think that we'd like you to take away from today are that the preparation is really, really important. As we said, think about weed control and it's worthwhile spending a year or more controlling the weeds, preparing the sward that you want to enhance, and finding the best source of donor seed for your project. The second thing is this issue of disruptions. We've said creating enough bare ground, and that's really, really important to change to disrupt the strong grass sward that you've got already. The third thing is that wildflower seed needs to be broadcast on the surface. Just please don't bury it in any way. And then the fourth thing is that the first winter and that first spring, that first year after that, is all about the broadleaf perennials getting established. And it's been suggested by, I learned this from Noel Kingsbury, who's a garden designer and plantsman, and he takes, he has encouraged us and really opened my eyes to taking the seedling's eye view of things. Imagine you're this tiny seedling trying to get established in the sward. As soon as the grass tries to cover over, then you're shaded out, you're not getting the light, and the competition is going up. You're not going to thrive. So whatever you could do to help the seedling thrive for that first 6 months of the year is really, really important. So here are a few of places to go for help and resources. We'll send these slides out to everybody afterwards so that you'll have access to this. This is all on our Herefordshire Meadows website, mostly under the resources pages, which are divided into meadow restoration, creating bare ground, the first year of managing. There's a section on diverse swards of all kinds, on soil health, and other sections there for you to look and see. There's some great videos available. Plant Life have a lot of them on their Magnificent Meadows, links there to the Magnificent Meadows website. There are other people like Keith Datchler with years of experience of creating meadows at different scales, which are great to watch. He's got a fantastic one. This is a link to one which I think sums it very, very, very well. A lot of the Pasture Fed Livestock Association webinars on meadow restoration have been some really good ones this winter. And again, you can get to them from our website. And Plant Life, who we're working with closely this year, are developing, they have a restoration flow chart that takes you through various starting points that you might have suggesting how you would go about different restorations depending on your starting point. And they're developing a fantastic app this year as part of an ELMS test and trial, which allegedly we're going to all be able to do this on our phones very shortly and get guidance on the best method for us. So that will be a great way of getting advice as well. So whatever your aims, I would really hope that this has been a useful session, and that you'll enjoy the benefits of making your swards more diverse, both just for the buzz and the joy and the fantastic feeling of being in a meadow full of insects, our native insects being able to feed and thrive on our native plants. That's what they're adapted to thrive on. So you're enjoying that benefit for yourself, health and well-being, for your soils, for your swards, then for your livestock, and for the wider landscape. And yeah, I think good luck, and we're going to answer some questions now, and encourage you to keep in touch with us through the contact page of our website if you're not already on our mailing list. And if you can't find enough information on the website to help you out, then we offer a service so that we can tailor a restoration plan to your meadow, whatever its size, and get you started on the process, and support you as you go through it. So I think that is the last slide. I'm going to stop sharing and stop talking and let Rory and Sue begin perhaps to look at what's in the chat. Have we got some questions there for us to answer?
Yes, I think we've got some quite interesting questions. A few of them I think you have covered in the talk. So the first one from Ronnie was to do about the timing of the harrowing. And I think we were sort of mentioning August, September timing, when the conditions are more favourable for that. So I think that would be the general kind of principle that we go for.
Yes, and we would think about the autumn. I suppose the thing to say there is it's fair is if you do it in the spring, you might think, well, why don't I do it in the spring and put the seed down? But the grass is growing so vigorously, then your little seedlings don't stand as good a chance. We do find that autumn sowing of the wildflower seedlings, late summer, autumn sowing is the time to do it. That's when it happens naturally, and you've got the winter then to play around with the grazing and keep it open and let the broadleaf plants establish.
Yeah. The two meadows where they did the tine harrowing, that was carried out in late September actually. The one thing you've got to think about if you're going to be putting seed down sort of in summer or early autumn, you want to be where you don't want to be putting the seed down if there's not going to be any rain. You really want the soil to be damp, and the rain will help the seed bed in. So you know, keep an eye on the weather. And following on from that, I think there was a question from Esther about whether you should roll the meadow after broadcast.
Oh yes, we didn't mention that.
Yes. And so if you've got cattle, then you probably don't need to roll the site. But I think it's probably err on the side of caution. If you've just got sheep, I would definitely use a Cambridge roll or something like that after seeding, because you don't want it to blow away. And that's another thing about seed broadcasting, is don't try and do it when there's a howling wind blowing, because seed is very light and it will blow away. So weather related things, yes, roll if you haven't got cattle. Carry out the harrowing when the weather's good, when there's some rain forecast. You've got a wide window. There's no set date. It doesn't have to be done on a full moon on the 15th of August, or, well, you could, you know, yeah. It's when your site is ready.
I think that point about trampling cattle and their ability to trample, I think also leads on quite nicely to a question from Robert Hall talking about the aftermath grazing. And obviously we've discussed already the importance of keeping the sward open. but maybe we want to mention a different grazing animals. And so the question here is whether sheep are appropriate, which I would say they are, but there are obviously differences between all the grazing animals that potentially could be used. I don't know whether that's something we want to.
Do you want to answer that, Sue?
Yes, okay. Yeah, sheep are fine. Cattle are fine. Obviously, during the winter, you know, Herefordshire Meadows are renowned, can be very, very wet, not all very good for cattle over winter. And you don't want to be poaching the meadow. The crucial thing about this first year is you've got to think about just keeping the sward low. You don't want to overgraze it. You don't want to get the grass too long. So you're probably looking at doing a number of short, sharp bursts of grazing rather than prolonged grazing throughout the winter. And once the fields start to get wet, you need to be taking the stock off, and you certainly wouldn't want cattle on them. So, but I mean, both will do the trick. And I think the other thing to bear in mind is once the grass has been eaten, get the stock off. Don't think, well, they can hang around for a couple of weeks and I'll chuck some hay out for them. I think no supplementary feeding on the newly created meadow over the winter. It's something. No hard and fast rules. You've got, you know, some winters there's a terrific growth of grass. Some winters are cold, and there's not a lot of grass. It's something you've got to be out every day, having a look and just maintaining that sort of that low even sward for that first winter. And then as soon as those first yellow rattle seedlings appear, then get the stock moved off, shut it up for hay.
Speaking of yellow rattle, talking about some obstacles potentially faced, there's a question from Mariel Lubman asking whether anyone's had problems with yellow rattle taking over.
Oh, yes, we have had that. So one of our very first visits when we first set up the network before we got any kind of funding was up to a farm in Michaelchurch, Escley, where they'd had this whole thing with very little hay, and the hay rattle had taken over, and the grazing, there was nothing really to harvest anymore for the winter. So they asked for a derogation to cut the hay rattle early, because it's an annual. If you don't let it seed, you are in control of hay rattle, really. If you cut it early, then you won't have the seed and the grass growth will come back. It came back incredibly. The year we went into waist high grass almost, and we couldn't find a wildflower there. It has come back into balance. So yes, that it can happen that it takes over, and you can do something about it. But I would say in a measured way, that was a very extreme reaction. Yellow rattle seed's valuable stuff. We're always looking for it for meadow restoration. We can harvest it for you and take some of it away so that you've got less and the grass will grow more, and we can use that yellow rattle for other meadow restorations. I have to say that we do have we're able to, we believe that this, you know, it's valuable seed, and we have a rate that we pay when we're harvesting seed to compensate people for that. So, Sue, do you want to add anything to that about rattle taking over?
Yes, it certainly can take over. But the other thing to bear in mind about it is that meadow restoration is quite a long-term process. And in the initial stages, you can get these cycles of plants getting themselves established, and yellow rattle is one of those. So you might find in the first couple of years huge flushes of yellow rattle and perhaps oxeye daisy and common cat's ear, one of the dandelion-like species, and these they all prosper for first years, and then the action of the yellow rattle suppressing the grasses gradually allows other species to come in, and you find over the years that things even out, and you get a more even distribution of the various species across the meadow. But we are, yellow rattles are really great species to get meadows started on the restoration road, and so it's a very useful one for us to harvest, and we would always harvest from a field if people have absolutely if it's carpeting the field.
That's great. So we do have members as well who are doing that balancing. Once the meadows with an established meadow, I'm thinking of the one in Clifford that we did that training day in, where they balance that in terms of they want enough yellow rattle to keep the mix of wildflowers, but it's a very important part of the relationship between the owner and the grazier to have enough hay as well. So not masses, but enough, and they keep that balance going very well. So I hope that answers Mariel's question. So have we got a few more? I'm conscious of time. We've only got a couple more minutes left before we finish, but
I can see a question about floodplain meadows, actually, and querying. Our floodplain meadow had one great year, and then after 2 big floods, the grasses have taken over. I would give it a chance to sort itself out. Don't just give it a couple more years. I think on some of the national nature reserves like Cricklade and possibly Porthome, after prolonged flooding events, the species diversity really did drop, and things just disappeared, and various grasses did take over, and things like creeping buttercup and holcuses absolutely thrive on those prolonged wet in the prolonged wet years. But on some of these sites, they're doing annual surveying, so they are finding that the meadow's restoring itself, and it's a matter of time, and we're usually terribly impatient, and we want these things to be right immediately. But my advice would be not to restore it, not to go down the restoration route for a couple of years at least, and do a bit of monitoring and see what happens.
Yeah, great advice, Sue. And we should say there is I don't know if you know, there's a Floodplain Meadows Partnership organisation who have a fabulous website. You can get to it from ours, or just type them into Google, and they've got that graph that Sue describes: flooding events, decrease in diversity, increase in grasses, and then they've got this lovely wiggly chart going, oh, I need to go this way across, but doing it. So yeah, that's absolutely it. Great.
We've had a question from Christopher Fairs asking whether we've ever tried sports ground scarifiers for site preparation.
Oh, good idea.
Brilliant. Yeah.
We could do. We've got somebody who's setting up a sports ground, and they're creating a meadow as well. So we know people use sand spreaders, don't we, sometimes to put the seed out. So they've done that for large areas.
Yeah, brilliant.
So but yes, that would be another piece of kit, wouldn't it? Sort of mid-sized one, and presumably able to calibrate as well. So thanks, Chris, for that. We haven't tried it, but that's another thing to add to the list. Great.
So on a smaller scale, my experience is I've used a power rake from Brandon Toolhar. So experience has been that scarifiers can clog up, smaller scarifiers. Just if you've got a really thatchy site and you're dealing with really thick grass, then it just isn't really got quite the oomph that you need. Yes, this machine, petrol-driven pushed machine, worked quite effectively on a small scale site where it wasn't appropriate using large machinery. So there are options out there, and we're always finding new interesting pieces of kit that we try out.
Yeah, and there's some of the cut and collect machines are really useful for scarifying as well, like the Rytec cut and collect and the Amazon flail, something like that, followed by spring tines, and they collect up all the vegetation. So also another good bit of kit, but not we haven't found many of them in the county. That's the other thing, not widely available.
No.
A question from Geraint Owen. about dandelions and whether they would be classed as a weed and need controlling.
Oh, they are fabulous for bees, but they can spread very far. What would you, that's the way they grow, isn't it? Covering lots of ground. What do you think, Sue? We were going through them today, weren't we, looking for little seedlings underneath?
Yeah. I think the site we were on today, they seem to have increased this year. But for example, on floodplain meadows, they're a really important component of that floodplain community. I wouldn't class them as a weed. No, is my answer.
No, good. Okay. Very good. So
I think there's a question from Robert Hall about a mature meadow that's not as flower rich a few years ago and why that might be. I think this probably links into the dynamism of meadows themselves. And well, last year, for example, it was so dry and it seems to be almost repeating itself now, and that will impact some species much more than others. And I think that's why you can see even year on year quite significant changes in terms of the floristic sort of diversity that you're getting. So that would be my interpretation as to why that might be happening.
Yes, difficult to know difficult to answer without knowing exactly what management is going on there.
Yeah, so do get in touch with us if you want to talk about that. I think please do give one of us a ring.
Yeah, happy to help out with that, Bob.
Good. I think we're going to have to call it to an end. If there are any questions still there, we'll try and answer them separately or individually. So I think with time in mind, I'd like to thank Sue and Rory very much for being part of this talk and helping and for all their comments. I'd like to thank you all very much for coming today. And I